Can get started. Thank you. Excellent. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kamran Khan. I am with Deutsche Bank. I head ESG for Deutsche Bank Group for Asia Pacific, based out of Singapore. We have a fantastic panel and a great discussion ahead of us on scaling up climate financing. We have, like I said, a very diverse set of panelists, investors, lenders, academics. What I'd like to do to make sure we get the most out of this session is, first, let me give you a general opening framework for what we would like to discuss. Then I'm going to introduce all the panelists, and we'll then jump right into a discussion. And if you have questions at any time, even during the discussions, raise your hand, and I promise I will try to get to you so that you are part of that discussion, okay? First and foremost, in terms of the general intro for this session, every time there's a discussion on climate financing, it invariably gravitates towards fossil fuel transition to renewable energy, and it never goes beyond that. But if you look at the corporates around the world, the economic landscape, you will notice that roughly 5 to 10%, depending upon the country, of the business activity, the corporates are on the left-hand side of a graph. So imagine a graph that goes across like that. So on the left-hand side, you'll have the pure, clean players. These would be the solar panel manufacturers, battery operators, manufacturers. So those are pretty simple, easy to understand green sectors. We all need to expand that side of the market as quickly and as fast as we can, right? And as big as we can. If you look at the right-hand side of that graph, you will see the traditional, not so sustainable businesses, the fossil fuel, mining, and so on and so forth. But when we talk about scaling up climate financing, and we only look at the extreme left and the extreme right, we're missing the big picture, which sits in the middle, which are the normal corporations engaged in everyday economic activity. And it's important for us to transition their operations towards sustainable practices, including reduction of emissions in whatever it is that they do. And so that is a key part of the discussion that we would like to focus on today. So, do we need to do to scale up renewable energy and so on? That debate will continue and that process continues. And what to do with the non-sustainable businesses. People have views on how quickly we should move on that and what the sequence should be. We can discuss those. But the bulk of the discussion hopefully will be for what do we do with the middle of the hardcore, the core part of the economy. Okay. So with that, let me start with first the introductions. First, we have Marc-André Blanchard, who is B20 co-chair, as well as obviously in his day job, executive vice president and head of CDPQ, big, large investor, as you all probably know. We also have on our panel Mr. Debiraj Sen, who is Managing Director and Head of Global Banking North India and India Lead for Sustainable Finance at HSBC. We have Dr. Runa Sarkar, Professor, IIM Calcutta, who is specializing in this transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy in India in particular. We have Ms. Ritu Arora, who is the CEO and Chief Investment Officer, Asia, for Allianz Investment Management. Again, big investor and a very, very large portfolio to deploy. And then last but not least, we have Roger Charles, who's Executive Director from the Investment Bank Sustainability Team at DBS Bank out of Singapore. So that's the panel, and let me now jump right into the discussion. And I would first like to go to Mark. Mark, how does CDPQ think about sustainability, first of all, as an investment theme? Are you focused on the left-hand side of that graph, right-hand side of the graph? But more importantly, how are you tackling the middle?
Well, first of all, thank you, Kamran. Thanks for the question, but I just want to say how pleased I am to be here in Delhi this morning and to represent CDPQ, but also be with so many friends on the panel. Allianz is a great partner of CDPQ around the world, and the banks here as well, and it's very nice to see also some people from the academia, because what I like is we all need to be part of the solution, and we all need to come to the table in a way we've never come together before to solve that. So where are we on the spectrum at CDPQ? CDPQ is, so you may wonder, what is CDPQ? So I'll make it concrete for you. We are an institutional investors, largely a pension fund, 6 million Quebecers, so it's in the province of Quebec in Canada. 6 million Quebecers are counting on us to deliver a pension when they will get the age of 60, 65 years old. And we also have 46 different depositors that are insurance schemes and stuff like that in relation to our government of Quebec. We've been in existence for 60 years. We have $425 billion Canadian dollars of investments around the world. We have $7 billion US invested here in India. We have, in India, we own some of, we have obviously some bonds, we're in the stock markets, but we're also in illiquid assets like in infrastructure. We're a big player in renewable, and through Apraava and Azure, and also we own some highways through our ownership of Maple Highway. And we want to invest more in India. We have been here since 2016 in a big way. We want to continue to be here and grow in some of our liquid assets in infrastructure and partially in the transition. So just to give you an idea of where we are often named, I mean, many benchmarkers are recognizing us as the #1 institutional investor in the world on the pension fund side for ESG and climate. We've had a long tradition. Since 2017, we calculate our carbon footprint. We have more than doubled our green assets. We have very, very strict objectives for the coming years. My pay, like the ones of everyone working for our fund, is there's a criteria about it's attached to part of our bonuses are attached to the reduction of our carbon footprint. So the entire people within CDPQ are aligned towards that. What do we believe in? We believe that actually it's important to invest, be a proactive investors and investing in the transition, in the renewable world, in everything that can be part of the solution. So for us, there's a proactive play, and this is why we actually have invested heavily in renewables in the last 5 years. We also believe that, as Kamran said, there's a big role to play with our portfolio companies. We own all sorts of companies around the world that have their own carbon footprint. And so we are now, it's very important for us to engage with each and every one of them, particularly the ones where we have governance rights, rather than on the private equity side or infrastructure or real estate, rather than the stock market. In the stock market, we engage with some, but obviously you can imagine the number is very wide. We own shares in more than 6,000 companies around the world. So we focus on the ones where we have scale and we have influence. But for us, the way we see that It's because we're creating value by doing this. By engaging in the transition, by engaging in ESG, by making sure that each of our companies and each of our partners are being part of that and on a journey towards some of the goals, we are creating value. We are also protecting values in our portfolio. So for us, it's important for the sustainability of our investments. It's important for our present and future returns. And for those of you who ask, that we often ask this question, get often asked this question: do our green assets perform better than our brown assets? And they do. And so this is important. We're not a charity organization. We have fiduciary obligations to actually, and we are an investors that have decided that we have a leading role to play in making sure that capital gets slightly better aligned with sustainable development. But we're not doing it to the detriment of our returns. And we believe it's not a choice between returns and actually the impact and the sustainability of the investment we make. And this is how we've lived that at CDPQ. And we are very engaged, and every investment we make goes through an ESG assessment. And last year we've done 700 of them, and where we look at each investment and how they fare on the ESG side. And I'll finish on that. Those of you who believe that, is ESG, what's ESG? And I've heard that, or I see that in the US, it's under attack. I see that in Europe, the regulation is going very aggressively on pro-ESG. Regardless, whatever the position you take on this, to me, it's not about ESG. Let's forget the vocabulary. It's about sustainability. And ESG was just a framework for sustainability. For those of you who don't like the vocabulary, forget about it. Like, just sustainability. You all want your assets to be performing over time. So it's just about that in my mind. And it's about that. And sometimes I prefer to have the framework of ESG because you look at the environment, you look at the governance, and you look at the stakeholders. Who are you dealing with? Your workers, your supply chain, and everyone in between, and your consumers, and your communities that you're around. And we believe that this is, it's not sustainable if we continue the way we are to be on the verge of unsustainability in many parts of the world, both from an issue of climate and from an issue of inequalities. And this is real, and it's real for investors. We spend way more time than before looking at the risk-return equation, yes, from a money perspective, but also more and more from a climate perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, from all of the other reasons that are non-traditional, and they're very important. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Let me now go to another investor. So, Ritu, can you walk us through, you all have a very well-structured framework through which you make investments, and you're accountable to all your shareholders and other stakeholders. Can you walk us through how you define transition finance, first of all, which is sort of tricky? What falls under transition finance, what falls and does not? How do you define it, and then how do you track it in particular?
Thank you. Maybe like Mark, I take a moment just to give a context and the world that we work in so that my answer resonates better. I represent Allianz. Allianz is a German insurance company and also an asset manager. One of the leading insurance companies, the second largest by most metrics in the world. And as a group, we represent $2.5 trillion plus of assets. So it's a big balance sheet that we make a commitment to sustainability with. The insurance being close to about $1 trillion. So it is large money, and Allianz is a net zero asset owner alliance with United Nations, a founding member. We work with CDPQ and similar other institutions because we realize that sustainability is a journey, transition is a journey that can't be done alone. The more the number of investors, the more number of consumers start demanding this is what will bring about transition. Coming specifically to your question, transition is not something that you can define in black and white at this point in time. It is a journey that has begun. It is at different points in different parts of the economy. But what we do is we engage intensively when we make investments. We engage intensively with the issuers to get a reassurance as to what is the transition journey that they are willing to commit to. And for that, it has to be aligned with our commitments on sustainability, which we have very boldly put out that of entire balance sheet that we own, we will have 25% reduction in all investments which is not sustainable by 2025, and another 25% by 2030 till we reach net zero. So we are a carbon neutral company forever. In 2015, we became carbon neutral ourselves. But now what we are talking of is in our business and in our assets. Now we need to hence map transition of these companies aligned with the transition that we are making. And for this, we use tools, and it is a very complex. So we exist in 70 countries, and we make no exceptions. So we are not saying, but Asia will follow, or but a particular economy will take longer because it has coal dependency. Hence, it is each investment person and each business person's responsibility. We don't have an ESG department which does this. So each one of us has imbibed it in our DNA. And for each of those investments, we then map what is the transition and sustainability roadmap that the issuer is willing to commit to. And then we assess if it maps well with what we want to achieve, and then invest, and then monitor and track it through the journey. So it is a very intensive process that we are committed to.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ritu. So your point is well taken that you as an organization have been net zero for quite some time. And it's now time to talk about what are your portfolio companies doing? What is happening with your money? So that's generally for those of you who wanted to connect the dots. This is where scope 3 emissions in particular come into play, where you say, I provided money, somebody used that money to build something which then created emissions. Those emissions hit my books as my scope 3 emissions. So with that, let me come to the bankers amongst us, and not me. Luckily, I'm the moderator today. So let's go first to Roger at DBS. Roger, banks are now being asked to track this very important metric called emissions financed, and which is basically looking at your balance sheet as a bank and saying, how many loans did I make this year? And from those loans, how many emissions can I expect? And what am I doing over the years to reduce that number as a proportion of my lending? How is DBS handling it?
Thanks, Cameron. DBS Bank, we set our net zero targets back in 2021. And we set that across 9 sectors, of which we have targets across 7 of them sectors, the usual suspects and carbon intensive. And then we've set data targets on 2 other sectors, and we'll consider them at a later date. So for each of these sectors, under our net zero scenario, we have decarbonisation trajectories and glide paths of where we're going to have to meet certain targets each year. So we have interim targets for 2030, and then every year in our sustainability report, we will issue our progress against each of these sectors. So it's an interesting space. I guess the easiest way to explain to everyone, it's like going on a diet for a year. That you've got to reach a certain weight at the end of the year. And so in the first quarter, you're eating you're eating whatever you want. You're eating McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, whatever. And then in your second quarter, you realize, okay, I've got to stop eating such high-calorie foods, and I need to move down a little bit and start eating a little bit more healthier. Third quarter, you're like, okay, I need to go on a proper diet now. And by the fourth quarter, you're fasting. So you get to the end of the year, and so where you are is where you are. Now, we do have to recognize there are going to be overshoots on these glide paths because of technology. You know, we have to understand that, say, you know, shipping or transportation, aviation, shipping are not going to decarbonize until the fuel companies get their act together and start policies put in place. And, you know, we've got, you know, sustainable aviation fuel, biomethanol, which is in plentiful, you know, quantities at a reasonable price. We're going to realize that the built environment, whether it be in data centers or real estate, commercial real estate, are not going to decarbonize until the grid decarbonizes. And in the case of Singapore, what, 95% of our grid is on LNG. Yeah, so we're going to have to import renewable energy into the country. So with all of that in mind, we understand that there are going to be overshoots, but how do we develop mechanisms internally? Well, us, like a lot of the other big commercial banks around the world who have, you know, who are, you know, GFANs or, you know, Net Zero Banking Alliance members, we've, on the back of setting targets, we're developing tools of where our relationship managers, our industry teams, can actually start to punch in the numbers of what does that client look like, what is their emissions profile, what is the financed emissions that are going to be attributed to our own Scope 3, our own financed emissions as a result of doing that deal in a carbon-intensive industry. And we can then sort of start to see, you know, do we finance client A or do we finance client B? What is it going to look like at the end of the year? What is it going to look like in the long term? And so that starts to give our relationship managers, starts to ingrain this thinking in the bank about, you know, the consequences of financing certain sectors. But that's out with the fact that, you know, I think goes back to your first point, Cameron, of where are we financing only the green stuff or are we financing the brown and the black stuff? And I think that by setting these glide paths, it's pushing a lot of finance towards the green part. But also, we have to recognize that financing needs to go towards the brown and the black part to help decarbonize. It also needs to go into the middle part, into the SMEs, of which, what, India, what, 45%? SMEs make up the industrial manufacturing sector. So in that in mind, you know, the energy transition is, in my view, as an engineer, spent 25 years in energy, you know, the energy transition is not going to be pretty. It's not going to be uniform for a start. But at some point, we need to understand that in order to help the brown and the black move towards the green, we're going to have to put money into there to help it transition. It's not going to transition by itself. And secondly, walking away from it is not going to help. It does no good. So I think it's a balance when we look at it in terms of how we achieve our glide path and why we're going to overshoot. It's to understand that it's not just about the green, but it's also about finance the transition of the black and the brown.
Great. Thank you, Roger. Love your dieting analogy. If you allow me, I would use it someday. Let's go to the Birna, HSBC. Can you share with us how you are thinking about handling this emissions finance metric?
Thank you. I think Roger did cover quite a bit of it. Essentially, I think most global banks are following broadly a same path. But I would like to pepper my discourse on this with some specific examples. So while at a broad level, everybody is trying to reduce the amount of financed carbon emissions, but we operate in different markets. And in the context of the emerging markets, there are some customizations which are often necessary because these markets are very different. The data set that you are working with is very different. The risk perception overall in financing anything in emerging markets are very different than that in developed markets. Now, globally, we did state our aspirations way back in 2020 that we would invest between $750 billion to $1 trillion till 2030 to partner our clients in their net zero transition journey. So that's the broad theme for us, and we are working towards that. Now, the fundamental approach that we follow here is what we call as a transition risk questionnaire. Now, this transition risk questionnaire is being rolled out for 10 specific sectors, which we consider as high-risk sectors or hard-to-abate sectors are definitely part of those. But the work has started with 10 major sectors in which globally we are expecting the coverage teams that cover these clients to run this transition risk questionnaires to figure out in more granularity in terms of the underlying risk and what path these clients themselves are intending to take. And as the results are coming out, it is quite fascinating in the sense that we are seeing some of the large carbon-intensive players having actually very practical plans in terms of their own transition. So what do you do about that? So let me take the specific case of one particular client. It's quite a global major. It did have a large carbon portfolio in terms of thermal power plants. And we specifically worked with the clients on two areas. One, which was the easier one, was that we today are in India their biggest financiers of their renewable portfolio. So that was the easy part of it. The difficult part of it was that they ideally were committed to their shareholders in terms of reducing their thermal portfolio. And we did bring in our advisory capacity there in that particular client to completely get rid of the thermal portfolio. So here is a case where we were working on both sides in terms of helping them increase their green and helping them reduce their black. And this is a model that we will increasingly adopt for large, complex clients in terms of working towards both. Let me take another very specific example. So, as you rightly pointed out that whenever there is a talk about sustainability, the talk generally veers around renewables, and that's the easy part because at least in India we seem to have cracked it pretty well. There's significant amount of capital available. The difficult part was in terms of the electric mobility because of the obvious reasons around the residual value of the collateral, the technology underlying it, and the transition that the technology is going through. And until recently, we haven't seen too much bank financing play in that particular sector. Now, here is a case where we have actually repurposed a very traditional product to serve that particular sector or need. So this is the case of a proposition that we have now come out to the market in conjunction with the largest EV player in the Indian market today, wherein we are saying that for certain retail customers who are employees of our corporates that we bank on the institutional side, we will do financing 100% of these EVs without creating a security. Now, what are we essentially doing here? We have taken our unsecured loan product, which exists for all banks in the retail domain, and extended it to the EV, because in any case, taking security to the EV was proving to be meaningless because the collateral value was undeterminable, and that was the key impediment. So we thought, in any case, we are doing unsecured loan product in the market for clients that we think are creditworthy. So why not extend that unsecured loan product from retail banking into the same, what we perceive as creditworthy segment of the market, and extend it to EV financing. So this is a pilot project that we are going to run with Tata Motors and gradually roll it out with some of the other large EV players. So we are trying to innovate according to the needs of the market, and I think innovation is a key here. I think significant work now needs to happen, obviously, in green hydrogen or pumped hydro, and the market is not even there in terms of getting out a proposition that works, because it's something that we understand. So it's a process which is ongoing. At the end, I would say that I'm extremely proud to say that, at least as far as India is concerned, 14% of our balance sheet is green today in India. I doubt how many banks in India have that kind of a number in terms of proportion of assets being green.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And one point you made which really resonates, which is that India seems to have cracked this renewable energy puzzle quite a bit. It's a long way to go, which takes me to Runaji and her research. It'll be interesting to hear from you what, from a financing perspective, what are the investors doing? And I'm talking about the buy side, like the two representatives we have from Allianz and CDBQ, as well as the sell side, the banks. Are they doing everything they can do to speed up the transition of energy production? And if not, what are the remaining areas where people are not going? So Debira just mentioned how they have picked a sector and started to provide uncovered lending to sort of instigate growth in that market. That seems to me like a very good example of what a bank can do to create market where it didn't exist quite to that magnitude. Are there other things that banks and both equity and debt investors can do?
Great, thank you so much for that. Clearly, you could see, I'm the odd one out here with all the investors and the bankers present. But I really liked Roger's analogy, so I'll just take that forward now, putting on my economist's hat. So you start out on a diet and you decide you have a target at the end of the year. And as he said, it's the McDonald's and the KFCs to start with, and then a somewhat toned down version, but high calorie by the next 3 months as well. And then what really happens is you fall ill. There are costs. There are costs to the KFCs and the McDonald's that you've consumed. So I want to add that additional layer of complexity, if you will, that there's a social cost to delaying our action towards climate change. Now, having said that, to specifically address your question, yes, indeed, there is a lot going on. Clearly, the renewable sector, also the e-mobility sector, we find a large amount of private finance flowing in the right direction. But let me also point out that the loan or the specially structured, the reworked financial instrument that we are talking about goes to the credit-worthy Tata Motors. So as long as it's private finance...
It does not go to Tata Motors. It goes to the retail client.
No, absolutely. I mean, what I'm saying is...
And we chose Tata Motors because they are the biggest.
By all means...
I love this. This is great.
By all means, what I'm trying to get at here is when we are looking at private finance, the risk-return issues matter. You talked about the fact that you'd have a transition risk questionnaire. It's important. Risk matters. And in the context of are we doing enough, then what matters is that there is a large part of the middle that Kamran was talking about where it is not very clear what the next new thing is. Which means if you make an investment today in that industry, there is a huge amount of risk, and it is unreasonable to think that the industrialist or the private sector could bear that risk. Hence, the role of industrial policy. This is why industrial policy all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but in the last 2 decades, has suddenly gained huge prominence, with today the developed world doing much more about industrial policy than the developing world. So what industrial policy does is actually make it clear to the investors, to the industrialists, what the direction of the economy is going forward. If a bank has decided to fund the retail in the EV sector, it's because the Indian policy on that is clear and unambiguous. The path is defined. So a lot of it matters as to how policy makes that clear as to what direction the country is going. Now, in that context, we know of net zero 2070. Is net zero 2070 achievable? In my opinion, yes, very much so. But what I want to point out is there is a cost to delaying net zero. There is a huge social cost, and the point is that social cost is not going to affect anybody in this room. It's going to affect those people who don't have a voice. Because climate change is affecting those people, and the sooner we can decelerate climate change, the better. And in that context, when we are talking about the financial sector, it's about a role now for development banks at the national level, starting to play a role in risk subversion, in working out a way where they can be the low returns holder of a loan, working on refinancing. So the SIDBs and the NABARDs of the country playing a much, much larger role in the context of scaling climate finance.
Fantastic. I really appreciate your comment that there is a significant social cost to delays. I hope that explains why you're here. You are not the odd one out here. You are the one who are putting us in the right direction of why does all this matter at the end of the day. Let me just add one more thing to Roger's analogy to kind of round this out. This comes from our Deutsche Bank experience. So when we think about managing this emissions finance number, we're, I think, very closely now moving towards the concept of a budget, which I would like to include in your diet analogy, which is each business division will probably very soon get a budget of how much emissions can you finance this year, given our trajectory. And with that, the business leaders have a choice. You can finance one really dirty deal, or you could finance 20 not so dirty transactions. And that's how I think the balance is going to be achieved over time for financial institutions. And that wouldn't happen if there was no requirement for disclosure, and that wouldn't happen if there wasn't pressure on them to reduce those numbers.
Cameron, can I add a point to what you and Rami just said? You were highlighting how there's a cost to deaccelerating or slowing the transition, the big social cost. Actually, there's a very significant other side of the coin as well, which is the cost of this transaction on the social aspects. So there are entire ecosystems around. For example, just to take coal as an example in India, there are cities, communities, schools, colleges, hospitals, livelihoods, which are associated with that form of coal as an industry. Now, as we move away and transition, there's a big social impact on lives of those people. There's a big social impact, and that is as much a concern. And now we hence talk a lot about just transition. Just because there's a social cost even to accelerate this transition. There's a social cost to not accelerate this transition. So it is a conundrum. It is a tough choice that each economy, government, and ecosystem is making. So
great. Now let me get you involved and have a quick setup for you, and then you can make your comment as well, Mark. We also had a discussion around risk, the importance of risk. And then we have, obviously, this emerging space of ESG ratings, which, by and large, reflect the risk that an investor takes in a company when he or she makes that investment, to say, when I buy in stock of this company, given what kind of operations it's involved in, what kind of risk am I taking from an E, S, or G perspective? How do you all, as investors, incorporate risk, and in particular ESG ratings, in your decision-making process for investment? Mark?
Well, thank you, Kamran. I will answer this one quickly, but I want to come back to Aruna on a few things, because how do we integrate ESG? Well, we do, for each of our investments, we do an ESG analysis. And the bottom line is, if you look at two companies, company A, company B, that actually have exactly the same kind of the financials look exactly the same thing, same industry. One has less women on the board. One has less diverse workforce. One uses way more water than the other one. The one has way more, doesn't care about the footprint that it has all over the place in terms of physical space and all of that. One uses way more fuel than the others, way less renewables. Which company do you think is valued most? It's obvious. It's the other one. So it's now about creating value. So for us, it's very clear on that front. The second point I wanted to come back to Runa, so it's related, that she's right. Risk returns do matter for all of us. We're in a capitalist system. Like it or not, this is the system we have chosen as a society. In some countries, we do a bit more and a bit less in others, but by and large, it's a capitalism that is and it's guided by the risk-return equation. So the point I want to make in this is, the first one is, there are ways to get, if we decide to make choices in a society, there are, we need to understand we're facing issues we've never faced before. Inequalities, climate change. It's going to take, estimates vary, but it's usually $4 trillion per year to actually tackle climate change that is needed in investments all around the world. We're investing approximately 20% of that now. And that's been a long time we've been trying to do that, at least since 2016 when the Paris Accord was, 2015 when the Paris Accord was agreed upon. We're moving slowly, too slow. Runa talked about, so the risk-return equation is just not right for many of the things that are needed in this fight against climate change. For all of us, the institutional investors, who to our depositors, that we need to actually have a return for their money. One thing Runa mentioned was the role of governments. I'll finish on that, Cameron. The role of government is key in here. The policies do matter. Look at what governments did all over the world for renewables. 20 years ago, in countries like Canada, private sector was not going into renewable. Why? The risk-return equation was not right. What happened? The government came in, gave some subsidies, pricing, uptake. They did it in all sorts of ways around the world. And then you get cities, I've heard here in your own country, where cities are 30% uptake is in renewable. In California, it's 25-30% as well. And the cost of solar lost in the last decade 90% cost reduction through all sorts of programs and policies like that. Policies do matter. To finish on this, look at the best policies I've seen in following these policies around the world. It's in the United States of America. In the last year, what have they done? The CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act for microprocessors, they now have, within a year, $210 billion of private investments that have been announced in the United States just because of this new alignment from a regulatory perspective. Look at the Inflation Reduction Act. they believe that actually it's going to move more than $1.2 trillion in e-mobility and the likes and all of the renewables and everything that is in the transition. You're talking about a country where half of the people don't recognize that climate change is a problem. But yet, it has moved. Why? Because now the capitalist system works, actually. It makes financial sense to make these investments for a private sector. So this is yet another lesson that industrial policy matters, governments matter in this field, and we should, like what you've said about making sure that the development bank, the national development banks, should be put on steroids everywhere in the world where it's possible to help with that de-risking. I totally agree with you. And it starts in my own country, Canada. And that should be, because time is of the essence, competition is fierce, and the money is moving very fast. Look at the last New York Times article last Sunday on what is happening in the US. It's an extraordinary article. It made me sip my coffee with a big smile, but also it just it shows that things could move fast. It gives me a lot of hope, but there's a lot of competition.
Thank you, Mark. The US is certainly a very interesting example, especially when you compare it to Europe. So you have Europe going with the, shall we say, more of a stick approach versus US going more with the carrot approach. So more incentive to drive market change versus a more stronger regulatory approach from Europe. I think most of us would agree that there's a need for both. And how do other countries find that balance? So, Dabirat, you had mentioned something about, from an HSBC perspective, that you have to have separate or different considerations for emerging markets, because I don't think most of the countries around the world can handle either a US kind of multi-trillion-dollar incentive package, or they can get as tough as EU can get tough. So how do you operate in those kinds of markets as a bank?
You are very right in the sense that emerging markets, the need versus the availability has always been an issue. However, the silver lining was seen, I think, sometime back in 2021. If you look at the overall sustainable debt issuances, which had peaked up in 2021, emerging markets did make quite a mark. But despite that fact, I think it is also a fact that 80% of the sustainable debt is going mostly into the developed markets and very less to the emerging markets. I guess sometimes we make too much of an issue around it, because if you look at a global bank, the way it operates in several markets has always remained a challenge, and it has always customized its own strategies to cater to those markets. So when you say that I have a no coal policy, which we do, it is a fact that we have to survive with as part of being a global network. But then the question is that how do you therefore contribute to the country in terms of the agenda that the country has set? So if you clearly take the example of India, and I'm very proud as an Indian, and not many people know it, so therefore it's important to share. Think of a country which actually has achieved a 25% non-fossil fuel based percentage in the energy basket. That's India. And depending on what you consider as non-fossil fuel, if you take hydro and those things, the figure rises to 33%. So India is making quite a mark. In terms of the renewable market, it is probably the third or the fourth biggest renewable market. And I think the data that the country is or has submitted to UNFCCC is the fact that in the last 14 years, India has achieved a 43% reduction in its emissions, which is really laudable. So when you are actually operating in a country such as this, I think the opportunities far outshine the limitations that your no-coal policy has. So it's fine. I think overall, if you look at the country's plans, India is planning around 20 to 25 gigawatts of thermal capacity. But the bulk of it lies ahead in the renewable stream. And therefore, you need to channelize increased amounts of capital into that. So,
Great, thank you. I've been told that we are running out of time, so I'd like to do a fast round, maybe 1 minute each for all our panelists. Can you tell us, are you positive about the future of this planet, given everything you know as experts and practitioners? And if so, one bullet point, why? You could say, yes, I'm positive, no, I have a very bleak outlook, or my least preferred option, you can say it's not clear yet. But let's start with, Renu, please.
All right, well, yes, I'm positive. And I'm positive because of my belief in the power of human agency, not only to muster up new technology, but to be able to engage within the social ecosystem to make that technology work.
Roger?
Yes, I am. I'm very optimistic. I believe we have the answers. We know what we need to do. But I think we just need to break down some barriers and realize that we can't do it alone. It will take a village to get it across the line, but the solutions are there.
I agree with Roger, and I'll just complete with what, I'll just complete with what they say, like the G20 is a very important point in this, because we need partnerships like we've never seen before. So we need people coming around the table like we've never seen before. As Renu said, the governments and the policy is important. So what is needed is making sure that each G20 members set up the right policy, set up the right financing, de-risking instruments in their countries. The rich countries should go all out and to create some of these de-risking instruments. And we should push for the reform of the multilateral investment banks all over the world, not only the World Bank, but the others. They should have more de-risking instruments. They should have more transparency to share their data and about their experience of investments. And they should also put project preparation on steroids. We need more investable projects all over the world. Those are the three asks for the multilateral development banks.
Great. Rituji, you want to go first? And then.
No, I'm not waiting for doomsday. I'm super optimistic. But I also know we'll have to do it together. And needs to be a sense of urgency around it. I was very recently asked the same question, so it seems to be a worry on many people's mind at another conference. And I'm reminded of the story of the starfish. A huge number of starfish got washed onto the beach. And there was this kid who was throwing those starfish back when someone said, you know, you can't throw them all back. And so you can't make a difference. There are too many of them on the beach. They'll all die before you can throw them into the sea. So he picked another one and threw back and said, at least I made a difference to that one. So if all of us are working together, which I think we are, and there's a sense of urgency, I'm quite optimistic and quite confident also.
Very certainly optimistic. I think the world has passed that inflection point in terms of accepting the reality and trying to work towards that. As far as countries are concerned, I think if you look at the emerging markets, they have long discounted the fact that money is never going to come from the so-called rich nations, so we need to work out our solutions ourselves. Very heartening to see the amount of progress emerging markets are headed towards, including some of the Latin American markets. I think the very fact that we have a very disparate panel today, coming from various different sectors and talking towards it, means that all of us are serious enough, and I see no reason absolutely why, as a world, we should not be able to hit the target well before time.
Fantastic. Let me give you my view, which is slightly different. I am also positive, but not because of the efforts of this generation, but because when I talk to young people, I know they are overwhelmingly left of center on these issues. So the real question for the Earth is, are they going to grow fast enough in time to become leaders of this world so that they can visualize and execute policies to get their type of world in place, or whether the world is going to blow up before they have the chance at it to do that. So it is positive, but I think we do need to see this demographic change in leadership to really execute it. Our generation will do the best it can, but then it really is about the next one because they have a totally different orientation on most of these issues. Thank you once again for your attendance, and thank you for our panelists for sharing very openly your perspectives.
Thank you, sir. We conclude this session with our gratitude to our distinguished keynote speaker, panel member, and moderator for their insightful discussion. I request our speakers to kindly gather for a group photograph.